The plastic pacifier lay sealed in evidence bag number 47B, its faded yellow nipple and distinctive butterfly-shaped shield catching the fluorescent light of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department cold case unit. Detective Maria Santos held the bag up to the window, studying the small object that had waited 32 years to tell its story. Outside, the California desert stretched endlessly under an October sky, the same relentless landscape that had kept its secrets buried since 1992. "You sure this is going to work?" Detective James Riley asked from across the cramped office, his voice carrying the skepticism of someone who had seen too many dead ends in cold cases. The walls around them were lined with filing cabinets and corkboards covered in photographs, timelines, and maps, the detritus of unsolved mysteries that haunted the department. Maria turned the evidence bag over in her hands, feeling the weight of 3 decades pressing against her chest. The manufacturer's logo is still visible. "Look here." She pointed to a tiny embossed mark on the shield's surface. "If we can trace the distribution pattern, narrow down the retail outlets." The case file sat open on her desk, photographs spilling across the worn wood surface like accusations. Baby Jessica Caldwell, 8 months old, discovered missing from her crib on the morning of March 15, 1992. The ransom calls that never came. The searches that turned up nothing. The parents who divorced within 2 years, unable to bear the weight of their shared loss. And this pacifier, found clutched in the tiny hand of another infant 3 counties away, a baby who survived an attempted kidnapping only because a neighbor's dog had barked at the right moment. Maria had inherited the case 6 months ago when Detective Bob Harrison retired, his parting words still echoing in her memory. "That baby's out there somewhere, or her body is. Either way, the family deserves to know." Now, staring at the pacifier through the clear plastic, she felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven her through 12 years of police work. The Caldwell house still stood on Maple Street in Riverside, a modest ranch-style home with a brick facade and a front lawn that someone still maintained despite the fact that neither parent had lived there in over a decade. Maria had driven past it countless times since taking over the case, always feeling the pull of those empty windows and the swing set that remained in the backyard, its chains rusted but unbroken. She opened her laptop and navigated to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database, the faces of lost children scrolling past like a gallery of broken dreams. Jessica's age-progressed photo showed a girl with dark curls and her mother's gentle eyes, forever frozen at what she might have looked like at 18, 25, 32. Maria had memorized every feature, every possible variation the computer algorithms had generated. The pacifier manufacturer, Gentle Dreams Inc., had gone out of business in 1995, but their distribution records were archived at a storage facility in San Bernardino. Maria made the call, her fingers drumming against the desk as she navigated through automated menus and departmental transfers. Finally, a human voice answered Eleanor Marsh, the records custodian who had worked for the company during its final years. "Gentle Dreams? Lord, I haven't thought about that company in ages." Eleanor's voice crackled through the phone connection. "Those butterfly pacifiers were our premium line. Expensive little things, only sold through boutique baby stores and high-end department stores. We had maybe a dozen retail partners in Southern California." Maria felt her pulse quicken. "Do you still have the shipping records? Distribution lists?" "Honey, I've got boxes and boxes of that stuff. Company policy was to keep everything for 40 years. You want to come take a look?" The drive to San Bernardino took Maria through landscape that seemed unchanged since 1992. Strip malls and housing developments carved out of desert, palm trees standing like sentinels against the mountains. The storage facility sat behind a chain-link fence, row upon row of metal buildings baking in the afternoon heat. Eleanor Marsh met her at Unit 247, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and hands that bore the calluses of decades of manual labor. "Here's what you're looking for," Eleanor said, hefting a cardboard box marked Distribution 1991 to 1993. The smell of old paper and dust filled the small space as she opened it, revealing manila folders thick with invoices and shipping manifests. These butterfly pacifiers, they were handcrafted in Oregon. Beautiful work, but that's why they cost so much. A single pacifier retailed for $28 back then. Maria photographed each relevant document, her phone's camera flash illuminating column after column of data. 12 stores had carried the butterfly pacifiers in Southern California during the relevant time period. She cross-referenced the locations with the map in her mind. 3 were within 50 miles of Riverside, close enough for someone to have purchased the pacifier locally before traveling to commit the crime. The first store, Baby Boutique in Palm Desert, had closed in 1998. The second, Little Angels in San Bernardino, was now a cell phone repair shop. But the third location made Maria's breath catch in her throat. Precious Moments Baby Store in Redlands, just 23 miles from the Caldwell house, was still in business under the same ownership. Margaret Chen had owned Precious Moments for 35 years, watching generations of families come through her doors. Now 78, she moved slowly between the displays of cribs and changing tables, her memory sharp despite her age. When Maria showed her the photograph of the pacifier, Margaret's eyes widened with recognition. Oh yes, the Butterfly series. I remember those because they were so expensive, and we only sold maybe 1 or 2 a month. Beautiful craftsmanship, but most parents couldn't justify the cost. She paused, studying the image more closely. You know, I do remember selling one of these around that time to a man. It was unusual because it was almost always mothers who bought our products, especially the premium items. Maria leaned forward, her notebook ready. Can you describe him? Margaret closed her eyes, reaching back through 3 decades of memory. Tall, maybe 6 feet. Dark hair, well-dressed. He seemed nervous, kept looking around the store like he was worried someone might see him. Paid cash, which was also unusual for such an expensive item. I remember thinking it was sweet that a father would splurge on something so special for his baby. Do you remember anything else? What he was wearing, how he spoke? He had a slight accent, maybe East Coast, New York or New Jersey. And he wore a wedding ring, which made me feel better about the purchase. But there was something. Margaret trailed off, her brow furrowed in concentration. He asked specifically for the butterfly design. Most customers just picked from what we had displayed, but he knew exactly what he wanted, like he'd seen it before. Maria felt the familiar electricity of a breakthrough. Did he mention a name for the baby? No, and I usually ask for our customer records. But he said it was a surprise and he paid cash, so I didn't press. Margaret moved to an old filing cabinet in the corner of the store. I kept all my sales records, though. Force of habit. If you give me a few minutes. The receipt was yellowed with age, but the date was clear. March 12, 1992. 3 days before Jessica Caldwell disappeared. The sale was recorded at 2:47 p.m. A single butterfly pacifier for $28.50, including tax. No customer name, but Margaret had written Cash Mail Customer in the margin, along with what looked like partial license plate numbers. 4G7. I started writing down license plates after we had some shoplifting incidents, Margaret explained. Just the first few characters, enough to help police if there was trouble. I remember this man's car was parked right outside the window, a dark sedan. Looked expensive. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she photographed the receipt. After 32 years, she had her first real lead. The drive back to Riverside seemed to take forever, her mind racing with possibilities. A man with an East Coast accent, driving an expensive dark sedan, purchasing an expensive pacifier 3 days before the kidnapping. It could be coincidence, but in cold case work, coincidences were rare. Back at the station, she ran the partial license plate through the DMV database, filtering for 1990 to 1992 dark sedans registered in California. The search returned 47 possible matches. She printed each registration, creating a wall chart that soon covered half her office. Names, addresses, vehicle descriptions. Somewhere in this data was the man who had walked into Margaret Chen's store 32 years ago. Detective Riley found her there at 9 p.m., surrounded by printouts and coffee cups. You need to go home, Santos. This case will still be here tomorrow. Look at this, Maria said, pointing to one of the registrations. 1991 Mercedes 560 SEL, license plate 4G7RNK, registered to David Brennan, address in Riverside Hills. She pulled up the address on her computer, a gated community just 15 miles from the Caldwell house. Margaret said East Coast accent, expensive car. Brennan's a New York name, right? Riley studied the registration. Could be Irish, could be anything. But the address is interesting. Riverside Hills was mostly doctors, lawyers, successful businessmen back then, someone with money to spend on expensive baby items. Maria was already typing Brennan's name into the criminal database. The search came back clean, no arrests, no warrants, not even a traffic ticket. She tried property records next, finding that David Brennan had owned the Riverside Hills house from 1989 to 1994, when he'd sold it and apparently left California. The buyer was listed as Dr. Patricia Morse, a pediatrician who still practiced in the area. "We need to talk to Dr. Morse," Maria said. "Find out what she remembers about Brennan, why he sold, where he went." Dr. Morse agreed to meet them at her office the next morning, a cheerful pediatric practice decorated with cartoon characters and bright colors. She was a woman in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her manner both warm and direct. When they mentioned David Brennan's name, her expression shifted subtly. "I remember David, yes. He and his wife Linda lived in the house before me. It was a beautiful place, but there was something sad about it. They'd been trying to have children for years, I think. Linda mentioned fertility treatments, miscarriages. It was heartbreaking." Maria exchanged glances with Riley. "Did they have any children while they lived there?" "No, that was part of the tragedy. Linda was so desperate to be a mother. The house had this beautiful nursery painted yellow with hand-stenciled butterflies on the walls. When I bought the place, Linda begged me not to change it. She said, maybe someday." Dr. Morse's voice trailed off. "I never did change it. Something about her pain. It felt wrong to erase it." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Butterflies. A desperate couple unable to have children. A man buying an expensive pacifier 3 days before a baby disappeared. Maria forced herself to remain calm, professional. "Do you know why they sold the house?" "David got a job offer back east. Pittsburgh, I think. Linda didn't want to leave. She decorated that nursery so carefully, had all these plans. But David was insistent. The sale happened very quickly, almost like they were running from something." They left Dr. Morse's office with a forwarding address in Pittsburgh and a growing sense that they were closing in on the truth. Maria spent the afternoon on the phone with Pennsylvania authorities, tracking David and Linda Brennan through property records and employment databases. The trail led to a modest house in Squirrel Hill, where the couple had lived until David's death from cancer in 2018. Linda was still there, listed as the sole owner. "I need to go to Pittsburgh," Maria told Captain Rodriguez that afternoon. "This is our best lead in 32 years. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying the evidence wall Maria had constructed. "It's thin, circumstantial, a partial license plate and a pacifier purchase 3 days before the crime. The butterflies, Captain. The nursery decorated with butterflies. The specific request for the butterfly pacifier. It's too much coincidence. And if you're wrong, if this woman has been grieving her infertility for 3 decades, and you show up accusing her of kidnapping..." Maria understood the concern, but something deep in her gut told her she was right. "Then I apologize and move on to the next lead. But if I'm right, Jessica Caldwell might still be alive. After 32 years, don't her parents deserve to know?" The flight to Pittsburgh gave Maria time to think, to review the case file one more time. Jessica had been sleeping in her crib when her parents checked on her at midnight on March 14th. When her mother went to feed her at 6 a.m. on the 15th, the crib was empty. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle. The window in Jessica's room had been left slightly open. Her parents always kept it cracked for fresh air. Someone had climbed through that window, taken the baby, and vanished into the night. But what if it wasn't a stranger? What if it was someone who had been watching, planning, waiting for the right moment? Someone desperate enough to steal another woman's child and raise it as their own? Linda Brennan's house sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees, their branches creating a canopy of shadows in the late afternoon light. The building was well-maintained but modest, a far cry from the luxury of Riverside Hills. Maria sat in her rental car for several minutes, studying the windows for signs of life. A cat appeared in one of the front windows, orange and well-fed, watching her with curious eyes. When Linda answered the door, Maria's first thought was how small she seemed. Barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair and tired eyes, she looked like someone who had carried a heavy burden for far too long. Her second thought was about the child visible in the background, a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, with dark, curly hair. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm Detective Santos with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your time in California." Linda's face went pale, but she stepped aside to let Maria enter. The house was neat but lived in, photographs covering every available surface. Most showed the same dark-haired girl at various ages' birthday parties, school events, family vacations. In the corner of the living room sat a dollhouse, its tiny furniture arranged with careful precision. "Emma, go upstairs and work on your homework," Linda said quietly. The girl looked between the adults with intelligent eyes before obediently heading toward the stairs. Your granddaughter? Maria asked. My daughter. Linda's voice was barely above a whisper. I adopted her when she was very young. Maria felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. That's wonderful. Adoption is such a gift. They sat in the living room, afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. Linda's hands shook slightly as she poured coffee from a thermos, the cups rattling against their saucers. On the mantel above the fireplace, Maria noticed a photograph that made her breath catch, a baby lying in a crib decorated with butterfly stencils. Mrs. Brennan, I need to ask you about March 1992, specifically about a baby named Jessica Caldwell who disappeared from her home in Riverside. Linda set down her coffee cup, the color draining completely from her face. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow, distant. I wondered when someone would come. 32 years, and I wondered every day. The confession spilled out slowly, punctuated by tears and long silences. Linda spoke of years of fertility treatments, miscarriages that left her physically and emotionally broken. David's growing distance, his frustration with her inability to give him the child he wanted, the depression that consumed her after their final failed pregnancy. I wasn't in my right mind, she said, wrapping her arms around herself. I know that now, but at the time, I was so desperate. I would drive around neighborhoods at night, looking at houses with baby clothes on the line, nursery lights glowing in windows. I became obsessed with this one house on Maple Street. I would park down the block and watch them come and go, the mother with her beautiful baby, so happy, so complete. Maria listened without interrupting, recording every word. Linda described her surveillance of the Caldwell house, learning the family's routines, noting that they always left Jessica's window cracked open. She talked about David's growing suspicion of her behavior, his discovery of the baby clothes she had started buying in secret. The night I took her, David was out of town on business. I had been planning it for weeks, but I told myself I would just look at her, maybe hold her for a few minutes. But when I climbed through that window and saw her sleeping so peacefully, Linda's voice broke. She reached up and grabbed my finger, and I knew I couldn't leave her there. She was meant to be mine. What about the pacifier? Maria asked gently. I bought it a few days before. I wanted everything to be perfect for her, the best of everything. When I saw those butterfly pacifiers, they reminded me of the nursery I had prepared. It seemed like a sign. Linda had driven straight home after taking Jessica, spending the next 3 days in a kind of trance, caring for the baby she now called Emma. When David returned from his trip and found them together, his reaction was not what she had expected. He was furious at first, threatened to call the police. But then he saw how happy I was, how natural I looked holding her. And Emma, she had stopped crying when I held her. David said maybe it was meant to be, maybe God had given us the child we couldn't have naturally. They had left California within the week, David claiming he had received a job offer in Pittsburgh. Linda had dyed Jessica's hair light brown and created a false identity for her, claiming they had adopted her privately. By the time they settled in Pennsylvania, Emma Brennan had replaced Jessica Caldwell completely. I tried to be a good mother, Linda whispered. I loved her so much, more than my own life. She's brilliant, talented, kind. She wants to be a doctor, like David was. She's everything I dreamed of in a daughter. Maria felt torn between professional duty and human compassion. The woman sitting across from her was clearly broken by decades of guilt and secrecy, but she had also stolen a child and destroyed a family. Mrs. Brennan, you need to understand that Emma isn't your daughter. Her real name is Jessica Caldwell, and her biological parents have been searching for her for 32 years. But I am her mother. Linda's voice rose, desperation creeping in. I raised her, loved her, sacrificed everything for her. She doesn't even remember. She was so young. Emma's voice from the stairway made them both turn. Mom, is everything okay? The girl stood at the bottom of the stairs, her dark eyes moving between Linda and Maria with growing concern. Up close, Maria could see the resemblance to the photos in Jessica's case file. The same facial structure, the same intelligent expression. This was definitely the missing child, now grown into a beautiful young woman. Emma, sweetie, this is Detective Santos. She needs to talk to us about our family. Emma came closer, her movements cautious. She was tall for her age, probably around 13 or 14, Maria realized. The math made sense. An 8-month-old baby in 1992 would be 32 now, not the child standing before her. I'm not Emma Brennan, the girl said quietly, surprising both adults. I've known for a while that something wasn't right. The lack of baby pictures before I was supposedly adopted. The way Mom gets upset when I ask about my early childhood. I found some newspaper clippings hidden in her room about a missing baby in California. Linda's face crumpled. Emma, I can explain. My real name is Jessica Caldwell, isn't it? The girl continued, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. And you took me from my real parents when I was a baby. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. Maria watched as 32 years of lies and secrets unraveled in the space of a few sentences. Emma Jessica stood straighter, her chin raised with a dignity that reminded Maria of the age-progressed photos she had studied for months. I want to meet them, Jessica said simply. My real parents. I want to know who I really am. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Linda Brennan was arrested and charged with kidnapping, but her age and obvious mental health issues led to a plea agreement that would send her to a psychiatric facility rather than prison. Jessica, now 14 and legally old enough to make certain decisions about her own life, chose to maintain contact with Linda, while beginning the process of reconnecting with her biological family. Robert and Helen Caldwell had divorced in 1994, the strain of Jessica's disappearance proving too much for their marriage. Robert had remarried and lived in Oregon with his second wife and twin sons. Helen had never remarried, never had other children, her life frozen in the moment when she had walked into an empty nursery 32 years earlier. The reunion took place in Maria's office, neutral ground for an impossibly charged situation. Helen arrived first, her hands shaking as she clutched a manila envelope filled with photographs and mementos she had saved. When Jessica walked through the door, both women stopped breathing. You have your father's eyes, Helen whispered, tears streaming down her face. But my mother smiled. Jessica moved slowly toward the woman who had given birth to her, studying her face with the same intensity. I remember you, she said suddenly. Not clearly, but there's something familiar about your voice, like a lullaby I used to know. They talked for hours, Maria and the department social worker facilitating carefully. Jessica learned about the nursery that had remained unchanged for 5 years after her disappearance, about the birthday cakes Helen had baked every March 15th, about the trust fund that had been growing in her name since 1992. Helen learned about Jessica's childhood with Linda and David, her academic achievements, her dreams of medical school. I don't blame her, Jessica said at one point, talking about Linda. She was sick, desperate, and despite everything, she did love me. She gave me a good life, education, opportunities. I can't hate her for that. Helen's generosity amazed Maria. Despite 32 years of grief and unanswered questions, she showed remarkable compassion for the woman who had stolen her child. She gave you what I couldn't. She raised you, watched you grow up. In some ways, I'm grateful to her for that. The case that had consumed Maria's thoughts for months was officially closed, but its impact continued to ripple outward. Jessica chose to keep the name Emma for daily use, while legally reclaiming her identity as Jessica Caldwell. She split her time between Pittsburgh and California, building relationships with both families while pursuing her education. Linda Brennan received treatment for the depression and anxiety disorders that had driven her to desperate acts 3 decades earlier. In her lucid moments, she expressed genuine remorse for the pain she had caused the Caldwell family, while still maintaining her love for the child she had raised. The butterfly pacifier remained in evidence storage, its small size belying the enormous impact it had made. Maria kept a photograph of it on her desk, a reminder that sometimes the smallest clues could unlock the biggest mysteries. The case had taught her that families could be created by love as well as blood, that forgiveness was possible even in the darkest circumstances, and that the truth, however painful, was always better than a life built on lies. On a warm afternoon in May, almost a year after Jessica's return, Maria received a graduation announcement in the mail. Jessica Caldwell Brennan would be graduating as valedictorian of her high school class, with plans to attend Stanford University pre-med program in the fall. The photograph showed a confident young woman flanked by both sets of parents. Helen and Robert had reconciled enough to support their daughter together, while Linda had been granted supervised visits as part of her treatment program. At the bottom of the announcement, Jessica had written a personal note. Thank you for bringing me home. All of my homes. Maria smiled as she pinned the announcement to her bulletin board, next to photographs of other solved cases and ongoing investigations. Outside her window, the California desert stretched toward distant mountains, no longer keeping its secrets buried in the sand. Sometimes justice took 32 years to arrive, but when it did, it brought with it the possibility of healing, forgiveness, and the remarkable resilience of the human heart. The The Caldwell case file was archived with a bright red solved stamp across its cover, but Maria knew its real resolution lay not in legal proceedings or evidence rooms, but in the gradual rebuilding of lives shattered by one desperate act so many years ago. Jessica would carry the complexity of her story forever. The love of two mothers, the grief of separation, the strange gift of a childhood that, despite its foundation of lies, had prepared her to face the truth with remarkable grace. In the end, the butterfly pacifier had done more than solve a cold case. It had reunited a family, brought closure to decades of questions, and proved that even the smallest piece of evidence could illuminate the deepest shadows of the human experience.